Byline Audio.
Hi there and welcome to the Byline podcast with me, Adrian Goldberg. This time, Israel's Voices of Peace, as the conflict in Lebanon intensifies and in the wake of the war in Gaza, triggered by the October the 7th attacks, we talk to two Israelis seeking peace and social justice in their country. Uri Veltman is the national field organizer of Standing Together, a grassroots movement mobilizing both Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel. And Eran Nissan is CEO of Mehaskim, a progressive digital movement in Israel. Eran is an ambulance driver, a medic in training who witnessed the aftermath of a mass shooting in Jaffa recently, in which 7 people were killed just minutes before Iran launched 200 ballistic missiles. Welcome both. On the day that we're recording this, Israel has continued to strike southern Beirut and Lebanon. Sirens have been sounding in southern Israel, and the Tel Aviv government has been waging war on 3 Iranian-backed armies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Joe Biden says he feels a full-on conflict can be avoided, but from where I'm sitting, Uri, the war has already started in all but name.
We are deep in war, which is an all-out war in several fronts. It's almost a year now since the October 7th attack by Hamas on civilian population next to the Gaza Strip, and the death toll in Gaza has been staggeringly high. More than 40,000 people killed there, among them more than 50,000 children, with an unfolding humanitarian catastrophe. In Lebanon, the Israeli army has been making airstrikes, air raids for almost 2 weeks now, including on the capital of Beirut. And with the threats and the launching of missiles by both Yemen and Iran, we seem to be on the start of what is possibly a regional war, set about not because it had to happen this way, set about because of the rejectionist policies of our own government, of the Israeli government headed by Netanyahu, that is vehemently opposed to any sort of a diplomatic resolution of the conflict, any sort of diplomatic agreement, both because of the extremist composition of Netanyahu's coalition government, which includes far-right parties for whom the current war, rather than being a catastrophe, is actually a dream come to life with their messianic and fundamentalist worldview, but also because of the political reasons of Netanyahu himself. He's bent on political survival, and he knows that his political survival is dependent on the continuation of this far-right coalition government. If he will stop the war through agreement, they will topple his government, and he will face early elections. And according to all public opinion polls since October 7th up until now, had new election been called today, Netanyahu and the parties that currently comprise his coalition are set to lose their majority. So really for Netanyahu, it's an act of political survival, of personal political survival. And mind you, because of the corruption charges that he's facing, it's also very personal to him indeed. If he'll be driven out of office as a result of early elections, his trial will resume with rigor and he might end up with jail. This is why we are seeing this war unfold on so many fronts. Not because it is bound to happen, but because of the current political leadership in Israel, matched, of course, by the extremism of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Iranian regime, but the current political leadership in Israel is bent on pursuing this goal.
And Uri, people would say that the October the 7th attack could not go without a response, that there had to be some kind of retribution to Hamas. But there are those in the West, even people who are sympathetic to Israel, who may look at Israel's response in Gaza and say that it went way beyond anything that could be considered reasonable retribution. It hasn't brought all of the hostages home. And you know that there are moves to try Netanyahu in the International Court of Justice for war crimes. Do you think that's justified?
Well, I want to stress a point that you've raised. Not only that the current war did not bring all the hostages back, but actually the actions of the Israeli army in the Gaza Strip have cost the lives of more Israeli hostages than rescued by military actions. The majority of Israeli hostages that returned back alive to their families did so in November 2023 in the framework of a ceasefire agreement, which comes to show that only diplomatic agreements can bring back the hostages alive. And the continuing and the expanding military action is not only detrimental to the lives and to the well-being of the Palestinians in the West Bank, the majority of which are civilians and are not Hamas militants by all means, but it also risks the life of Israeli hostages. And indeed, many Israeli hostages, their bodies were recovered in areas in which the Israeli army was active, and they were killed as the result of the Israeli army bombing or military excursions. You mentioned retribution following October 7th. When I go back to the statement made by leading politicians in Israel, in the days following October 7th, we see the scope of the kind of retribution they were thinking at. Our Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, in a press conference that he convened shortly after the October 7th attack, he announced that he aims to cut electricity and food supplies to the Gaza Strip, basically tightening the siege on Gaza, which is an act of collective punishment, which goes against international law. And he justified it with the words, "We are dealing with human animals and we shall treat them as such." He wasn't focusing his words on Hamas militants or on the political leadership in the Gaza Strip. He was trying to characterize, to portray the civilian population in Gaza as a whole, the Gazans, the Palestinians as a whole, as non-humans, as subhumans. Different statements to this effect were made by other leading politicians in Israel, both members of parliament, but also ministers who wield executive power. This stresses that the far-right and extremist character makeup of the current Israeli government show that what they are dealing with is not statesmanship, a state responding to it being attacked by other military force, but what they are creating on the ground is an act of collective punishment, is a dehumanization and the targeting of an entire people. And this has a terrible human effect, a terrible human cost on the civilian population in the Gaza Strip, with many peoples who had nothing to do with the October 7th attack and nothing to do with Hamas have lost their lives as a result. But also, as an Israeli, as a Jewish citizen of Israel, I am deeply concerned that this dehumanization would have a long repercussion on Israeli society, because dehumanization also dehumanizes the dehumanizer. And if we ever hope to have an Israeli society that is democratic and equal and healthy democracy, it cannot go hand in hand with racist rhetoric, with genocidal rhetoric, with nationalist rhetoric, and with portraying millions of Palestinians as enemies and as subhumans. In the end, after this war will end, there will still be millions of Palestinians living on this land alongside the millions of Jews who live on this land. This must be the basic starting point of any rational, solution-based approach to the reality that we are facing. But unfortunately, our extremist government rejects this notion in total.
Eran, I can see you nodding away there vigorously in agreement.
Yes. So first of all, I think that it's important to put things in context. You know, when people in the international community and around the world, they think about the October 7th attack, what they equivocated with like 9/11, the September 11 attack. But this was completely different, because before September 11, the people in New York and in the United States didn't know what or who Al-Qaeda was. But the people in Israel, Jews and Arabs living inside of Israel, and the people in the Gaza envelopes, in the kibbutzim and the towns that were attacked by Hamas, they knew who Hamas was. For years, they've been talking that across the border, across the fence inside of Gaza, the ruling party is a recognized terror organization, and they were crying to the government, to Netanyahu's government, that, again, to remind our listeners, in the last decade and a half, Netanyahu was in power continuously, except a year and a half with the Bennett-Lapid government. They were saying, you're strengthening the extremists and you're oppressing the moderate voices, the pragmatic voices. And we knew who Hamas was, and we saw our government strengthening Hamas, financing Hamas, giving political capital and legitimacy, and doing whatever they can to increase the support to the extremist parties in Israel, but also in Palestine.
So when you say that they effectively built up Hamas, how did they do that?
So actually, there's Bezalel Smotrich, one of the more extremist ministers, also the Minister of Finance. He's the representative of the far-right settlers, Jewish fundamentalists. There's a quote in 2015, and he said, "The Palestinian Authority is a liability and Hamas is an asset." And this line is the Netanyahu legacy, and not just the legacy, the policy. We have seen time after time that Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, and Benjamin Netanyahu, they had what we call antagonistic cooperation. They had the same interests. They were all about weakening the pragmatic moderate voices. They're doing whatever they can to sideline political process that will result in a political agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. And even now in the past year, for political reasons and their own survival, whether politically or literal survival, they were doing whatever they can to prolong the war.
Aaron, when you say that, though, you're not suggesting that Netanyahu funded Hamas, but you're suggesting, I think, that the actions that he took and that his government took ensured that views became more polarized rather than less on both sides.
So again, we need to put things in context. For the last decade and a half, the Gaza Strip was under siege by Israel. Israel has control over the aerial space, the maritime space, the transfer of both good and people. And the humanitarian crisis in Gaza started much earlier than October 7th. And in the last couple of years, there was the risk of Gaza collapsing into humanitarian, social, and economic mayhem. And so the Netanyahu government authorized the financing of Hamas by Qatar. And there is a quote by Netanyahu from 2019 that said that anyone who supports our efforts of stifling the establishment of a Palestinian state need to support these money transfers to Hamas. And again, there is security coordination with the Palestinian Authority, which is far from perfect. I have a lot of criticism about the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, both in Gaza. We have Palestinian colleagues and friends and allies that are waiting to step up and replace this old corrupt leadership. But on one side, there is a leadership that is pragmatic, that is moderate, that is denouncing violence, that time after time is calling for a political process. And then you have extremists that are calling for violence. And it's important to understand that the struggle right now in Israel and in Palestine is not between Israelis and Palestinians, is not between Jews and Arabs. It's between Jews and Arabs who understand that our future here is together, and we need to build it together in equality and in respect and in shared values. This is one group, and the other groups are Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, who believe that there is only one place for one people here, that the use of violence is legitimate, and they want us to fear each other and hate each other.
Some people would say that inequality is baked in to the existence of the state of Israel, that its constitution privileges Jews who have no connection with the historical land of Israel have greater rights to settle in Israel than people who may have been living there, Palestinians who may have been living there until 1948. Is that a fair assessment?
So first of all, Israel does not have a constitution. I think the lack of a constitution is part of the problem. And in the year prior to October 7th, we were engaged in civil protest, the biggest civil protest in Israel's history against what we call the judicial overhaul, this attempt by the extreme right-wing government to dismantle the checks and balances, to have overriding power. And if there's one thing that the current Israeli government is united around is Jewish supremacy. And yes, there is institutional discrimination and inequality in Israel, both de facto and de jure. But there are civil movements that are trying to tackle this inequality and institutional discrimination and create a reality where we have a government that is working for all of us, no exceptions, that we're trying to celebrate our diversity and to celebrate the things that are worth celebrating, but also working very, very hard to fix the things that needs fixing.
I want to reinforce what Eran just said. It's true that Israel is a deeply discriminatory state towards not only the Palestinians who live in the territories it military occupied in the 1967 war. Israel also practices discrimination in all walks of life towards its Palestinian minority. Around 20% of the citizens of Israel, who are citizens of the state of Israel, eligible to vote, but in fact, they are being discriminated against formally and informally. This must change. It's not a new reality. It was born with the state of Israel in 1948, but we can imagine a different kind of state and a different kind of society, and we are actually pursuing it. There is a vivid civil society in Israel with organizations that are led jointly by Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel who work against discrimination, against racist practices, to change law, and more importantly, to change the political climate. You cannot legislate equality in a society that don't hold high equality as a core value. So need to counter the attack of the far right on people's minds, on people's ideas, and on people's heart, and to push for an agenda of consistent democracy and equality. And Israel has a vivid civil society that has done so, sometimes with more success, sometimes with less so. And currently the far right has the upper hand because it is in power. It holds the will's power within the government. But movements such as Mechazkim, movements such as Standing Together, and many, many others are organizing everyday Israeli citizens, Jews and Palestinians, to fight against that, to fight for equality and to fight for a more consistent democracy within Israel.
At the same time, we are here at this point where Iran, and I don't think there's any serious dispute about this, is backing three groups. It's backing Hamas, it's backing Hezbollah, it's backing the Houthis in Yemen, all of whom wish to see the destruction of the state of Israel in its current form, who wish to see you presumably dead. So when you're in that kind of situation, you can understand, can't you, why the majority of people in Israel will say these people need to be resisted. Perhaps these discussions that you're having are for another day, but here, right now, we need to militarily resist the people who would wipe us off the face of the earth.
Well, I'm 40 years old. When I was in elementary school in the 1990s, these were the years of the Oslo Accords, the Oslo peace talks between Israel and the PLO. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shook the hand of the PLO chairperson Yasser Arafat, something that was unimaginable. And as a schoolgoer in elementary school, I remember how our teachers sat us down and we drew drawings of Israeli flags next to Palestinian flags. This was in the mid-1990s. This scene would have been unimaginable today with the rising hostility and more than 25 years since the collapse of the Oslo talks. What this comes to show for me is that things can change for the worse, but that also means that things can change for the better. Our current reality is not static and is projected into the future indefinitely. And like reality has changed for the worst, not because of some act of nature, but because of the political action of political actors. Therefore, we can change things for the better through the political action of political actors. We mustn't accept as common sense reality within Israel that the way to deal with the ongoing national conflict is through bombing Gaza back into the Stone Age, is through bombing Lebanon back into the Stone Age. The option of diplomatic negotiation, of reaching agreements with that part of the Palestinian leadership that is willing to have a Palestinian state alongside Israel based on UN resolutions and based on ethnic occupation is an option that must be put back on the table. And movements such as ourselves are fighting towards that end. Also, mind you, pressuring the Israeli politicians, including the politicians of the center and the center left, that at times share the political postulates of the right wing and don't raise the banner of diplomatic negotiation and Israeli-Palestinian peace high enough, which forms part of the problem. Why can't people in Israel imagine a reality of Israeli-Palestinian peace? Because almost the entirety of the political spectrum in Israel is united behind various options of war and escalation. We need to revive a peace movement in the streets, which would be projected also into the political arena, forcing politicians that are currently equivoting on this to stress that this must be done, Israeli-Palestinian negotiation towards peace.
Eran, how easy or how difficult is it at the moment to stand for peace in Israel at a time when Iran and its proxies are sending missiles in your direction?
So, my father was born in Iran. He grew up in Iran, in Tehran, until he was 18. He went to high school in Iran. His childhood friends were Iranians. The Iranian people are not my enemy. My wife, Shir, her grandparents came from Yemen and Morocco. And right now we're getting missiles from Yemen. The Yemenite people are not our enemies. And just this week, we had two terrorists come from Hebron to carry out an attack in Jaffa, where I live.
And this was the attack that you witnessed the aftermath of this attack, yes?
Yes, I was there. I treated the wounded, and it happened in Jaffa, where Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish Israelis try to build a shared reality and shared lives of respect and mutual solidarity. It's difficult and challenging to talk about peace, to invoke this political imagination, this optimism, this hope. But we're not doing this because this is easy. We're doing this because it's hard, because people, especially after October 7th, they lost the ability to imagine a future which is constructive, that is optimistic. But hope is like a candle in a dark room, and you need a very, very dark room so you can see the candle and you can see the light of hope. And when everything is amazing and optimistic, people don't need hope because they have certainty. And hope is connected to uncertainty. But I can say that I feel empowered because I know that we are not alone. Organizations around the world, like the Alliance for Middle East Peace, like the New Israel Fund that has an amazing UK branch, are working to support civil society in order to build not just hope, but actual peace. And in the recent G7 convening in June, there was a united declaration about the commitment of the international community to support peace building efforts through financing and funding and supporting the civil society in Israel. Reiterated again last September in the UN General Assembly. And what we need right now is the recruitment of the international community, similar to what happened in Northern Ireland. 12 years before the Good Friday Agreement, they established the International Fund for Ireland to support people-to-people programs, to support reconciliation work far before they had a political agreement. Because it's not that political agreements arrive and then only the violence stops and then you start building reconciliation. You need to build the public support for the politicians to feel the pressure from underneath them to strive and pursue political agreements. And what we need right now is the international community not to be architects, not to think that this is a transactional thing, to try to organize and orchestrate peace between Israelis and Palestinians. We need the international community to stop trying to be architects and start being midwives, to understand that it's for us to deliver peace. And they need to offer support and expertise, but not try to control us. And we see this amazing work again. I'm going to travel to London in a couple of weeks for the New Israel Fund yearly event. We're doing whatever we can to bring the voices of young Israelis and Palestinians who speak differently than our government, and trying to not just paint a picture of a future, but actually tell the amazing stories of young Israelis and young Palestinians in Israel and Palestine that are working every day to build the life that we deserve.
I want to mention that we are recording this talk on October 4th, which is the anniversary of the battle in Cable Street, where fascists, a mob, tried to parade through London's East End, and it was blocked, obstructed on its march by Jews and non-Jews that united forces in order to stop the poison of anti-Semitism and the poison of fascism in British society. They correctly recognized that anti-Semitism targets Jews, but not only targeting Jews. Anti-Semitism targets the very moral fabric of society, like racism. All sorts of racism target the very moral fabric of society. And in this day, it is worthwhile to mention that here in Israel, we have our own Muslims. Currently, some of them are wielding power, like our Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who minutes after the Jaffa shooting incident, in which 7 Israeli citizens were shot to death by 2 Hamas militants, came to the scene and suggested perhaps we should demolish the nearby mosque. saying that perhaps it was somehow connected to the shooting incident, which of course it wasn't. On the day after, Jewish and Palestinian residents of Jaffa went onto the streets to hang posters in Hebrew and Arabic saying, even in these tough times, we will get through this together. So encouraged by the spirit of the battle in Cable Street, I'm encouraged to see that while we have our own Muslims, we also have our own anti-fascists who, like our predecessors 88 years ago, unite across national lines, religious lines, ethnic lines to stop the spread of racist poison through the veins of our society, recognizing that it threatens not only the minority group targeted, but threatens the very moral fabric of our society as a whole.
Been absolutely fascinating to speak to you both, and I hope we speak again soon. That's Uri Veltman and Eran Nissan. I'm Adrian Goldberg. This has been the Byline podcast, and we are the podcast arm of the Byline Times. If you want to support our work, and of course, I would encourage you to do so, please consider taking out a subscription to the Byline Times. It's a fabulous monthly news periodical that drops on your doormat, and it contains, in the printed edition, content that you can't read anywhere else, as well as the best of our online articles. So do head over, if you can, to bylinetimes.com and take out a subscription to the Byline Times. This has been a Byline audio production in Birmingham by me, Adrian Goldberg, and we'll see you again very soon. Thanks for listening. Bye now.